This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there.
From Innistrad to Shadowmoor, what spooky top 10 does Nitsuhone have in store?
Hi everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. It's October, so it's time for a spooky MTG Top 10, and in this one we'll be looking at Specters. Spectre is one of Magic's oldest creature types, with the iconic Hypnotic Spectre appearing in Alpha. Over the last 30 years, they haven't actually printed very many other Specters, with only 26 of them in all of Magic. However, for such a small number of cards, they have been surprisingly successful. It's definitely one of the game's spookiest creature types, as flavor-wise, they represent undead beings who can erase your memories when they touch you. This ability to get rid of memories is reflected by the fact that most Specters make your opponent discard cards. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point, this includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's take a look at Magic's top 10 Specters. At number 10, it's Sadrax Spectre. For 1 blue, a black, and a red, the Spectre is a 3/2 with flying, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card. It also has Unearth for 1 generic and a black, which means you can pay that cost to bring it back from the graveyard and give it haste until end of turn, and then it gets exiled at the beginning of the next end step. The Spectre gives you a reasonably efficient flyer who can go after the opponent's hand, and the addition of Unearth means you can end up taking away more than 1 card. The Spectre only has 1 point, and it came in a Grixis control deck in the Standard of 2010. At number 9, it's Spectre of Moreality, the newest Spectre to make the list. For 3 generic and 2 black, this Spectre is a 3/3 flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, you can exile 1 or more creatures from your graveyard. Then, all other creatures get -X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards you exiled. In other words, if you have a well-stocked graveyard, the Spectre can come down and wipe the board of everything but itself. Even when it can't quite do that, it can much more easily take down a bunch of small creatures. It's seeing a bit of sideboard play in Standard right now, where it can be brought in against decks where -1/-1 or -2/-2 kills most creatures. It's likely to gain more points in the future. At number 8, it's Shiman Spectre. For 2 generic and 2 black, it's a 2/2 with flying, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player reveals their hand and you choose a non-land card from it. Then you search that player's graveyard, hand, and library for cards with the same name as that card and exile them. So, in addition to taking out a card in hand like most Specters, Shiman Spectre also has the ability to get rid of all copies of that card, which is pretty sweet. This Spectre saw some sideboard play in both block and Standard, and it's particularly good to bring in against decks reliant on 1 card in particular, especially if it's a relatively expensive card that the Spectre can get rid of before your opponent ever has a chance to cast it. At number 7, it's Whispering Spectre. For 1 generic and 2 black, this Spectre is a 1/1 with flying and infect. Infect means that the Spectre does damage to players in the form of poison counters and to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. When it deals combat damage to a player, you can sacrifice it, and if you do, your opponent discards a card for each poison counter they had. Obviously, if you're playing this in an infect deck, it can sometimes take out your opponent's entire hand, even if they have like 7 cards. Now, the awkward tension there is that if your opponent has 7 poison, you may not want to get rid of the Spectre since your opponent is close to dying from poison. It was played in Block Constructed, where it was played, as you'd expect, in mono-black infect decks. At number 6, it's Reaper of Night, the largest Spectre on the list. Reaper of Night costs 5 generic and 2 black for a 4/5, and when it attacks, if defending player has 2 or fewer cards in hand, it gains flying until end of turn. It also has an adventure called Harvest Fear, a sorcery which costs 3 generic and a black, and it makes your opponent discard 2 cards. If you cast the adventure side first, you exile the Reaper and you can cast it from exile for the rest of the game. That means you can ultimately get a 3-for-1 out of this one card, and it also makes it more likely it will gain flying when it attacks. Reaper of Night has a pretty high ceiling for a common, and that's resulted in it seeing some play in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal. It generally sees play there in mono black decks, and it's likely to gain more points in Pauper going forward. At number 5, it's Blazing Spectre. For 2 generic, a black and a red, Blazing Spectre is a 2/2 with flying and haste, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card. Lots of Spectres have abilities that trigger when they hit the opponent, and flying often helps them get there. Blazing Spectre is the only one that also has haste, which makes it even more likely that it can get in, including on the turn it comes down. As soon as you get rid of one card with this kind of trigger, you're already going to finish ahead of your opponent, and if you can get rid of more than one card, things will feel amazing. It was played in black-red aggro decks while it was in standard. At number 4, it's Liliana Spectre. For 1 generic and 2 black, it's a 2/2 flyer that makes each opponent discard a card when it enters the battlefield. Most Spectres make you get in for a hit, but not this one. It disrupts the opponent immediately. It sees play in Devotion to Black decks in Pauper, where the fact that it ups your Devotion by 2 for your Grey Merchant of Asphodel makes it especially attractive. At number 3, it's Thief of Sanity. For 1 generic, a blue and a black, Thief of Sanity is a 2/2 flyer. When it does combat damage to a player, you look at the top 3 cards of their library and exile one of them face down. You can cast that card for as long as it remains exiled, and spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. So this one doesn't involve any discard, but it does still take something from your opponent, in this case, cards from their library. Notably, even if the thief dies, you get to hold on to the cards you have exiled with it, and that's pretty great because it's card advantage. It saw a bit of play in standard Esper control decks, and it also saw play in the sideboard of the now banned out of existence Dimir Inverter deck in Pioneer, but it hasn't gained points anywhere since 2020. At number 2, it's Hypnotic Spectre, the original Spectre and easily the most iconic one. For 1 generic and 2 black, you get a 2/2 flyer that makes the opponent discard a card at random when it does combat damage to them. It was a very important card in the early days of Magic because it was a highly efficient flyer that could greatly disrupt the opponent's game plan thanks to the random discard effect. Plus, you could combine it with Dark Ritual to play it on turn 1, something that will quickly lose your opponent the game if they don't have a quick answer for it. Both times it was legal in standard, it saw significant play. Its first time through, it was played in black aggro and black control decks. The second time, it was played in aggro and mid-range decks. It's also gained a couple of points in Legacy Mono Black Aggro. It doesn't have any points since 2007, and it's an interesting card to think about in today's Magic. If it was reprinted, I'm not sure it would see play, despite how powerful it used to be. These days, a creature has to leave value behind even if it gets killed right away, and a 2/2 for 3 mana that needs to attack at least once to have an effect just doesn't cut it anymore. And at number 1, it's Nightveil Spectre. For 3 blue-black hybrid mana, the Spectre is a 2/3 flyer, and when it hits your opponent, that player exiles a top card of their library, and you can play cards that it exiles. Unlike Thief of Sanity, which we saw earlier, you don't get to pay mana of any color to cast those cards, but you'll still end up hitting cards you can play often enough. After all, if you hit a land, you can just play that. It found a ton of success in Standard, and a big reason for that was its mana cost. Because it's hybrid, Nightveil Spectre added 3 to your Devotion to Blue and Devotion to Black. So while it was in Standard, it was good in both blue and black Devotion decks, 2 of the best decks in the format that had access to powerful payoffs like Grey Merchant of Asphodel and Master of Waves. It hasn't gained any points since 2015, but it has a massive lead over all of Magic's other Specters, and it's going to remain the number 1 card on this list for the foreseeable future. So, those are the top 10 Specters in Magic. If you want to own any of these spooky creatures, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed the video, do me a favor and like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more Halloween-themed MTG top 10s from over the years, you can find the playlist in the description, and you'll see it on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.